Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those of you on the West Coast. This is Josh Woolley, and on behalf of PCI, I'd like to welcome you all to today's GovCon 101, covering types of contracts, joined by our expert instructor, Ariel, Debin, and Collinsworth. Before we begin, I do have a few housekeeping announcements and reminders. For those of you seeking credit, please make sure you are tuned in, listening closely, and engaging in the polling questions. We do have about 3 polling questions that will pop up throughout the session. Make sure you guys submit an answer. You'll see the poll pop up. You can click on the response on the screen or submit it through the questions tab. The questions tab is at the top right of your GoToWebinar window. You can submit any questions, comments, and anything you'd like to communicate. We will not take questions until the conclusion of the slides, but we do welcome all questions, so make sure you submit them throughout the session. You can find a copy of the materials under the Materials tab at the top right of your window with the paperclip. If you have any technical difficulties, make sure you let me know. I want to make sure you have a smooth experience. And with that, I thank you for joining. I will hand it over to Ariel.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Joshua. And thank you and hello, everyone, for joining me today for today's GovCon 101 course, Types of Government Contracts. So quick introduction for me, I'm Ariel Collinsworth. I'm an attorney at the law firm Shepherd Mullen in Washington, D.C., part of our governmental practice, where I focus on really all things government funding, helping companies navigate the complicated world of government contracts and grants, really anything where you have government funding involved. That's kind of what I do. Within my practice, I work particularly with a lot of supply chain related issues like country of origin and restricted sources. I do a lot of commercial contracting issues and a lot of federal grant opportunities. But at my core, I'm first and foremost always a core government contracts attorney and have been doing government contracts for about 10 years now. Of course, a big part of working in government contracts, no matter what your role is actually understanding what the different contract types are, how and when you might be able to take advantage of them, and what some of their common restrictions are. So that's a great reason for today's course. And there's a lot to get through today, but before we kind of dive into today's topic, I actually wanted to kick things off with our first polling question. It's like a little bit of a pop quiz before you even learn the material. But I promise it's an easy one. And so I think if we can get that thrown up on the screen. So I'm just curious primarily, how much experience do you have with government contracts? Is it a lot of experience? You live and breathe government contracts. You have some experience. You've worked on a government contract or two before. You know what the FAR and DFARS is. You're no newbie to all of this. You have very little experience, or you have absolutely no experience. It has something to do with government and contracts, right? But I've never actually done this before. So you guys just submit those answers so I get a little bit of an idea of kind of how much you all know about government contracts. All right, looks like we've got 79% voting. Looks like most of you are falling in the category of some experience. You've dealt with government contracts before, but it's probably not something you deal with, live and breathe every single day like I do. And we've got some with absolutely no experience and some with very little experience. Great, thank you for that. Again, just wanted to get an idea of kind of the audience today, how much you all may know about government contracts and today's topic in particular. So let's certainly get into that. We're here today again to talk about types of government contracts. Now, there are over 20 different FAR and non-FAR kind of basic government contracting types. On the screen, you have a nice contracting cone from the Defense Acquisition University that recognizes 23 different contracting types. And then we have financial assistance agreements and grants, which get you to that 24 that's mentioned in the course description for today's lesson. I stick with saying there's over 20 because some of the technical groups in the cone are a little duplicative, fall under the same general umbrella, and because the cone doesn't recognize key contract or pricing types that you all might be aware of too, such as fixed price, time and materials, cost type contracts. This is likely because many of the types of contracts you see on the screen can likewise be mapped to those what I'll call pricing types instead of contract types. So Today's topic might be more readily called kind of contract vehicles, or basically it's all the different ways you can enter into agreements with the government for some sort of funding or support. And then within those agreements, you might have different funding structures, like, again, fixed price, cost type. But for today, we're going to focus, I'm going to stick mostly with these 20-ish contract types. Some we may go through a little faster than others. Some we may skip towards the end because it's a lot of information to cover in just about an hour. So just kind of bear with me as we plow through these. But my goal for today primarily is to provide you all with sort of an overview of these different contract types, so that at the very least at the end of today, you understand what they are and when they're commonly used. We're also going to talk about the intent and authorizations for these types, restrictions on these types of contracts, common applications, pros and cons of the different vehicles discussed, etc. I probably will not be reading off the slides verbatim. There may be information on the slides that I don't discuss at all. And that's mostly, again, because the information's there for your benefit. You have the slides to take home with you and review as needed. Some of it gets a little duplicative, and I don't want to waste anybody's time by just repeating myself for 40 slides over and over again. So I'm going to try and focus on the pieces I think are the most important. But of course, if for any reason I go too fast, you want to look at the slides longer, drop a question, comment to the chat feature, and we'll try to monitor those and jump back. Hope is to get through all these within with a few minutes, of course, left over at the end for questions. So again, we'll monitor the questions throughout today and get to all of those at the end, but please do submit them as they come up and they're fresh in your mind, and we'll be sure to get to as many as we can at the end, depending on how much time we have left over. And I think so with that, we'll go ahead and dive into our first contract type. We're essentially going to work our way around the DAU cone in the same order, which generally follows the sections of the FAR. And that brings us to our first section, the federal supply schedules in FAR point 8.4. Federal supply schedules or multiple award schedules are managed by the General Services Administration. GSA has authority to issue these multiple long-term government-wide contracts to federal contractors that provide authorized purchasers like federal, state, and local government buyers access to commercial products and services solutions at kind of these pre-established, pre-negotiated prices. The MASS program is broken out into 12 large categories based on the types of products or services, then divided further into subcategories and special item numbers or SINs. So you'll have, IT, software and hardware on one side, and then you might have professional services or office equipment on another side. They're broken out into different categories depending on what you sell to the federal government. How it works is GSA negotiates these contract terms and conditions with contractors under a particular schedule, including things like price, establishing a discount structure, and the price protection for the government as well. These schedules are published on the GSA e-schedules library, where then authorized purchasers, again, can issue task or delivery orders, establish blanket purchase agreements with the schedule holders in order to order products and supplies, all without having to go through competition for each purchase. So DoD wants a stapler, they can go to GSA Advantage and kind of search for stapler, and I'll show you all of the contract holders that are selling staplers, and they can just purchase straight from there as if it were an Amazon type website. Some important restrictions, of course, primarily that the schedules program is limited to the acquisition of commercial products and services, and offerors have to go through an oftentimes complicated process to justify not only that their products are commercial, but that the prices offered align with commercial practices as well. Another important restriction is that you cannot use cost type contracts or orders under the schedules program. You're working primarily with fixed price contracting, though you may have certain kind of time and material and hourly rates depending on what you sell. Like if you have professional services, you might have those fixed hourly rates for those services. Some most common applications included there, again, those are all types of things that are kind of covered by the different scheduled contracts. If you're interested in learning a lot more about the GSA Schedules program, GSA offers a ton of free resources on their website explaining everything, how to get involved in the program, what the regulations are. In the upper right-hand corner, there's also a little book that's actually linked, and it'll take you to the GSA Schedule Handbook, which is a book published by my practice group, actually, where we give you kind of the soup to nuts, everything you could possibly want to know about the GSA Schedules program. But there's a lot of information out there if it's something you're curious about learning more about. Some of the primary pros when dealing with the schedules contract program Again, you have a streamlined acquisition procedures, particularly at the agency and order level, which reduces that burden and procurement lead time. Might take some time to get established on the GSA schedule as a contractor, but the process for agencies to actually order your products is streamlined and does not require that competition. So it's fairly quick as soon as you're on schedule to then actually be delivering things to your government customers. Pro for the government, not only are prices typically lower than if procured through standard competition, but there's also room for government customers to further negotiate those prices. In fact, there's a contractual discount structure which guarantees the government keeps the lowest and or best price throughout performance. There's some ability to customize your terms and conditions, allowing commercial contractors to incorporate their standard commercial terms and conditions like their EULAs as well. There's also reduced burden compliance burden when contractors are subject to kind of a streamlined subset of FAR and DFARS clauses, because these are commercial acquisitions, they're limited to commercial products and services, which we'll discuss in a moment. Then they have kind of those streamlined FAR and DFARS clauses that you have to comply with. There's often reduced risk for government customers because schedule holders have already been pre-vetted by the GSA as responsible and offering reasonable prices. And it can make it easier for the government to meet socioeconomic goals, because if you're listed as a small business contractor on the GSA schedule, they order from you. Now they can count that towards meeting their socioeconomic goals. As with all things, there are some cons as well. It may technically be a streamlined process, but it still requires significant investment of time, effort, and money to set up the infrastructure needed to comply with GSA's requirements needed to get on schedule. Despite what the GSA says selling on schedule is nothing like buying commercial, you still have to comply with a lot of FAR requirements, with some of the GSAM requirements too, that just look very different than actually selling commercial. As a contractor, you often end up selling at prices lower than what you might through open competition. And again, remember, there's always that opportunity to for the government to negotiate even further discounts once they're actually ordering from you than just those prices you have on schedule. Contractors also have to pay an administrative fee for using the schedules program. Again, it's limited to fixed price and time and material contracting, no cost type contracting. You're limited to selling commercial products and services that you can prove qualify as commercial. And as hinted before, there's a unique requirement in the GSA to establish a kind of a baseline most favored customer, a discount relationship with the GSA based on that customer that can trigger a price reductions clause obligations, requiring you to essentially rebate the government for any sales below your established market prices. And it takes a lot of effort to build the infrastructure to be able to comply with those obligations. And it's the primary thing that GSA is looking for when they're doing audits and investigations relating to schedule holders as well. So that's kind of federal supply schedules in a nutshell. Similar to the GSA schedule, program is the kind of broader category of commercial products and services acquisitions under FAR Part 12. Under FAR Part 12, the government not only has a statutory preference for procuring commercial products and services, but also the government has attempted to kind of implement a streamlined acquisition process for agencies to more efficiently procure products and services that meet the definition of a commercial product or commercial service in FAR Part 12. These streamlined procedures also apply to non-developmental items and commercially available off-the-shelf items, which are sort of subset of commercial products. And in short, to be commercial, your product needs to be of a type customarily used by the general public or for non-governmental purposes that's been sold or offered for sale to the general public. Commercial products are allowed to have some customization to meet your government needs, but COTS products that are commercially available off the shelf essentially have to be off the shelf. They have to, no customizations allowed there. Non-developmental item, on the other hand, is one used and developed exclusively for governmental purposes. And under DoD acquisitions, these streamlined procedures can also be extended to non-traditional defense contractors, which essentially are defense contractors who have not had cost accounting standard or CAS covered contracts over the past 2 years. The general thought or premise behind Part 12 is that when the government's procuring items already available in general commerce, the full negotiated procurement process does more harm than good by not only making it take longer to procure simple things like staplers and printers, but also by deterring companies that provide these products from government contracts because they do not want to or cannot comply with standard FAR and DFARS requirements. So in some important limitations, obviously FAR Part 12 can only be used if you're dealing with commercial products and services, non-developmental items, traditional defense contractors if you're in the DoD space. Typically, this requires a written commerciality determination by the contracting officer that acknowledges your product as commercial. It's not something you can usually just say, oh, I offer a commercial product and the government's going to believe you. There has to usually be some written determination. Similar to GSA Schedules 2, cost type procurements are not allowed. We're again really only dealing with fixed price and time and material contracts. But if you can meet all these requirements, then you not only can take advantage of kind of that streamlined acquisition, the shorter procurement times, but also, again, fewer mandatory FAR and DFARS clauses for commercial contractors as well. Pros and cons of commercial contracting, all of them should look fairly similar to the GSA schedules we just walked through. Again, streamlined procedures means that the procurement lead time isn't as long. That as a commercial contractor, you have that, again, streamlined set of regulatory requirements applicable to your contract. FAR 52212-5 provides a list of all the clauses that are mandatory for commercial contracts and generally discourages agencies from incorporating additional requirements. It's the government's effort to try and make commercial item contracting look as much like commercial practice as possible, but of course it's not. It's still government contracts. You have exemptions for things like the cost accounting standards if you're a commercial item contractor. If you have COTS products, there are even a few additional exemptions available, such as the partial exemption under the Buy American Act relating to the domestic content threshold. So falling into this category can really provide a lot of benefits from a compliance and administrative burden perspective. Some cons: for starters, you're stuck selling commercial products and services, which generally reduces your ability to provide customized solutions that might meet the government's need. Things also may get complicated where you're hired to incorporate your commercial technology into a larger government system. The risk of cost overruns remains on you in the fixed price context if that integration is more complicated than you anticipated. Even though the whole process is supposed to be more streamlined, remember, it's still a government contract. There's still rules and requirements that you have to comply with that look very, very, very different from standard commercial practice. And that includes requirements to, again, prove your products are commercial, to justify the prices you're offering, and then a whole bunch of kind of regulatory requirements that are just quite different from standard commercial practice. So taking a step away from commercial contracting a little bit, but sticking with some of the government's policies permitting other than full and open competition. In FAR Part 13, we have these simplified acquisition procedures. So these typically come into play when acquisitions are below certain dollar thresholds. So for example, an acquisition below the micro purchase threshold can be procured really without competition using government purchase cards. And the contracts themselves really only are subject to a small handful, and by that I mean like somewhere between 5 and 10 maybe, of FAR and DFARS requirements. Right now that micro purchase threshold is $10,000. The QR code on the screen is for a proposed rule where the FAR Council is looking to bump that up to $15,000. So if that gets passed, gets implemented, then purchases below $15,000, you have that extremely streamlined process where government can just use purchase cards to kind of procure things under the micro purchase threshold. When you have acquisitions above that threshold, but below the simplified acquisition threshold, which is currently $250,000, but proposed to move to $350,000, the government gets to use streamlined procedures, but a little bit more than the micro purchase threshold. They can use informal quoting and competition. They can award contracts without the need to go through lengthy negotiations and this formal evaluation process and the back and forth. These same procedures are allowed for acquisitions of commercial products and services up to $7.5 million, proposed to move to $9.5 million, and acquisitions in support of certain contingency and humanitarian operations up to $15 million, soon to be $20 million. Simplified acquisitions can be used through kind of a variety of mechanisms, includes through the use of purchase orders for products and supplies below the acquisition threshold, simplified acquisition threshold. Also, the government could establish a blanket purchase agreement, essentially giving simplified method for the government to fill anticipated repetitive needs when the actual need is not necessarily known at the time of contracting. Some of the key restrictions, again, Aggregate value of the contract must be below the listed thresholds to use these procedures. Agencies can't use the simplified procedures if the requirements can be met through other pre-established contracts like FAR Part 8 mandatory sources, which includes the GSA schedules program, existing agency IDIQs, or really any other contract vehicle that they could order from. You can't just create a new contract if there's something out there that the agency could be using. Acquisitions under the simplified acquisition threshold are mandated to be set aside for smaller disadvantaged businesses unless the contracting officer makes a determination that fewer than 2 offers are available to meet the government's needs. And use of government purchase cards are generally preferred if not necessarily mandated, particularly when acquisitions are below that micro purchase threshold, the 10,000 soon to be 15,000. All right, pros and cons of simplified acquisition procedures. Number of laws and regulations, including FAR and DFARS clauses that are not applicable to acquisitions below the simplified or the micro purchase thresholds. So similar to commercial acquisitions, there's some reduced compliance and administrative burden with these types of contracts and the actual performance and regulatory requirements that apply. Establishing that agency-wide BPA makes competition even more streamlined, where it would not be required to place individual orders against that BPA as soon as it's established. Some cons. Obviously, the government's limited by the acquisition thresholds, which makes it difficult or impossible to use these simplified procedures for more complicated, large-scale acquisitions. There are even strict rules against breaking up acquisitions to try and fit under these applicable thresholds. And we'll talk about this a little further on with the discussion of IDIQs, but multiple award BPAs, though there's less competition requirements to issue an order against them, would still require the agency to give each BPA holder the opportunity to respond to an order. So you're not kind of escaping competition altogether. It's just a little bit more streamlined and informal. There's also no minimum guaranteed amount if you were to enter into one of these BPAs. There's again no guaranteed amount, so there's no guarantee that the government's actually going to order what they say they're going to order. It's just kind of a preset standard form of terms and conditions and prices. All bear with me 1 second while I trade out my headphone, since this one has apparently died. Okay. So taking a turn now from some of the simplified procedures into available to commercial contractors, low dollar value procurement opportunities, and FAR Part 15. We have your standard kind of government contract procurement vehicle or competition type, and that's contracting by negotiation. So these are, again, your standard procedures for competitive, meaning full and open competition, as well as non-competitive, meaning sole source, open market acquisitions that exceed that simplified acquisition threshold. By open market, I mean products and services that are not available from required sources of supply, such as GSA schedule as outlined in FAR Part 8. FAR Part 15 is the most widely used contracting or solicitation type in the FAR. Under negotiated procurements, the government's given the ability to negotiate with offerers before making award, following the standard process of creating an RFP, determining competitive ranges based on offers submitted, ultimately negotiating with contractors within that range to award contracts. FAR Part 15 aims to minimize the complexity of the contracting process by providing clear guidance on solicitations, evaluations, source selection decisions, but also is primarily aimed at the goal of fostering comprehensive evaluation of offerors and competition, ultimately leading to the selection of the offeror representing the best value to the government, not necessarily the cheapest offeror. These procedures might be designed to ensure the government's receiving the best value, but the process ultimately can be lengthy and time-consuming, particularly where negotiations are involved, revised offers can be submitted, contractors can be entitled to debriefings after selection, and that's before you even get into like the bid protest process after an award has been made. Few restrictions on the use of FAR Part 15 procedures. Again, only real restriction is that contracting by negotiation can't be used if the requirements can be met through a pre-established contracting vehicle. Again, the agency can't really reinvent the wheel in order to create a new contract if something else is available they could order from. FAR Part 15 also talks about sole source procurements, sole source awards, just awarding to one individual contract without real competition. They can be made, but only in one of three situations. The item is available only from one source, it's a brand name, and the government needs that brand name. There's a public emergency, or the government attempted to use these FAR Part 15 procedures, but competition was ultimately deemed inadequate and there was really only one offerer available. When using sole source, the government will usually be required to issue a justification and approval. Depending on the contract, there may also be additional approvals necessary within the government to issue a sole source award too. It's not usually something they can just kind of decide to do on their own without those additional approvals. Pros of contracting by negotiation. Best value contracting sometimes allow you to offer higher prices than your competitors, and that you might offer in the commercial marketplace if you can still justify that you offer the best value to the government. There's greater flexibility in the types of contracts you can use. For example, we finally have a contract type that allows for the use of cost type contracting if that's something you really are just dying to do. Biggest con, though, of course, are the other longer procurement times. It can take the government months, sometimes even years, if bid protests are involved, to actually complete a procurement, which does not lend to quick delivery of capabilities. We're dealing here with standard traditional government contracts, which means you're no longer getting the benefit of that narrowed or streamlined FAR, DFARS clauses. Government has the power to impose more stringent requirements on you as a contractor. Also, typically with negotiated contracts, you're dealing with negotiations involving numerous companies and potential less likelihood of actually receiving an award because you have to go through that full competition instead of just kind of those simplified procedures or even through the GSA schedule. Okay, so we are moving right along now into FAR Part 16, which conveniently enough is called Types of Contracts. I sort of previewed this at the start of today's class, but we're actually only going to talk about a couple of these in detail, and that's 16.5 IDIQs and 16.7 agreements. But I would be remiss if I didn't at least touch on these other subparts, particularly where we have some kind of newer government contracting members joining us today. So I just want to make sure that we're going over topics like fixed price contracts, cost type contracts, time and materials, because I've mentioned them already, and I want to make sure you all at least know what we're talking about when you hear those terms. We obviously don't have the time again today to sort of map these different pricing types to the various contracts types that we're already talking about, but I know PCI offers numerous classes that go into these categories in even greater detail if that's something you're interested in. So quick overview of these like kind of three buckets. First, fixed price contracting, fixed pricing type, whatever you want to call it. These contracts provide for a firm price or in some cases an adjustable price. Firm fixed price contracts provide for a price that's not subject to any adjustment on the basis of contractor's actual cost in performing the contract. So fixed price contracts with economic price adjustment allow for an upward or downward revision of the contract price if certain contingencies occur, such as increase in established prices, adjustments based on actual cost of labor and material. That's usually allowable where there's kind of doubt concerning the stability of the market or labor conditions at the time of contracting. You also have fixed price incentive contracts, which have a fixed price that provides for the adjustment of profit and a price ceiling negotiated at the outset and gives contractors an incentive to kind of work efficiently on the program to increase their overall profit based on that formula. So on our sliding scale of risk, fixed price contracts place the most risk on the contractor that there might be cost overruns in performance, for which the contractor is not going to be entitled to an adjustment usually. On the flip side, if there are cost underruns, the contractor is allowed to keep the delta between fixed price and the actual costs, providing that incentive for the contractor to perform effectively, keep costs at a minimum. But this kind of sliding scale of risk is why the government typically prefers fixed price unless there's another justification for why one of these others should be used. On the bottom, you have cost type contracting. These are contracts where the government agrees to pay the contractor for cost of a project plus an additional payment, which might be a fixed fee, an agreed upon profit margin, something similar. Here, performance risk shifts to the government, where the contractor has less incentive to really efficiently perform the contract because the government has agreed to pay for all eligible costs incurred during performance. So the government now bearing the risk of those cost overruns, not the contractor. Contractors in particular often do not like these cost type contracts, even though there's technically less risk in that performance, particularly because they tend to require compliance with detailed cost accounting standards and accounting systems to meticulously track your costs in line with procedures and requirements in the FAR, such as allocating costs to eligible versus ineligible or indirect and direct buckets. And they're notorious for resulting in government audits and can lead to investigations and litigation for non-compliance with cost tracking terms. So I know a lot of government contractors who try and avoid these, even though the risk is on the lower side for the contractors. It just kind of depends on what your systems you have established. In the middle, we have time and material or labor hour contracts. So these are used basically when it's not possible at the time of contracting to establish accurately the extent or duration of work or the anticipated cost with a reasonable degree of certainty. Typically, the contractor and the government are negotiating a fixed hourly rate that the government's going to pay for material, and then the government will also pay for materials used in performance. When we're talking about time and materials, labor hours, similar approach. They work at a fixed hourly rate, but materials are not included. We put these in the middle as they tend to balance the risk between contractor and government, but they do tend to be some of the least preferred method in the FAR and require the government to obtain special kind of approvals in order to use T&M contracts. But you'll often see time and material and fixed price contracts combined, where many elements as possible will be fixed price, but things like if you have professional services in addition to the products you're selling might be priced as a time and material or hourly rate CLIN on your fixed price contract. So again, quick overview of what we're calling the common pricing types that we don't have time to kind of walk through in a ton more detail, but just want to make sure that you all are at least aware of what those terms mean for when they get mentioned in today's lesson as we continue to go through this. So moving further into FAR Part 16, we have indefinite delivery contracts and FAR Subpart 16.5. Or indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contracts, or what you might see as IDIQ contracts. So these contracts are used when the government wants to order certain supplies or services over a period of time, but doesn't know the exact quantities or delivery schedules in advance. Typically, in order to set these up, the government must agree to purchase a minimum amount of the goods and services at the prices in the contract. But beyond this, the basic amount, there's no guarantee of the amount that the government has to purchase. Even if the IDIQ is valued at $1 million, the government isn't guaranteeing that you'll actually make $1 million off of that contract. The IDIQs are usually awarded with a base period of performance and several options, allowing these contracts to extend for quite a long period of time at times. And in order to purchase goods or services, the government will issue task or delivery orders against that base IDIQ. Several ways an IDIQ can be established. An agency can establish its own IDIQ either by providing a single award or multiple award to several different vendors for the goods or services it needs. There also are some of these government-wide acquisition contracts, or GWACs, which are government-wide IDIQs established by one agency for use by essentially every other government agency, but typically limited to procurements for IT. There also are multi-agency contracts, or MACs, which again are established by one agency but can be used by other government agencies to obtain the supplies and services covered by the MAC and extend beyond IT as well. Again, IDIQs can be awarded on a single or multiple award basis, but there's a preference for multiple awards. Competition is typically occurring at the base IDIQ level, which is why they're a popular method, because once you establish your IDIQ, the process of issuing orders is much more streamlined. However, in a multi-award situation, the government does have to give every IDIQ holder the opportunity to respond to a need before placing that order. In a single award situation, they can just place the order against the IDIQ without any sort of competition. Again, IDIQs technically have no funding other than that minimal guaranteed amount. All of your funding is coming in from the actual orders themselves, but the IDIQ lays out all the key terms and essential terms and conditions that will apply to each and every order. They're automatically incorporated in, includes pricing, delivery, all of that, making the contract negotiation per order very streamlined as well. Couple of examples of common GWACs and MACs on the screen before. If you're familiar with government contracting on the GWAC side, I would imagine most of you have heard of the NASA SOUP program, which operates a little like the GSA Schedules program, but for IT and is run by NASA. If you're a small business, you might have heard of some of the other GSA programs like the GSA 8A STARS program. On the MAC side, again, IDIQ is held by one agency but can be ordered off of by other agencies for more than just IT. I think the most common tends to be the GSA OASIS contract, but there are some other DoD ones, DoD DISA, and I think Navy as well, some of those examples. And I think we have another quick polling question for you all. If we can throw that second question up on the screen. Okay, so what type of contract is the GSA Mass FSS schedule contract? Is it a GWAC, a MAC, a single award IDIQ, a multiple award IDIQ, or is it none of the above? It's something entirely different than any of those. Give you guys a minute to respond to those. – 48% voted. Just a few more of you. Give you a little bit more time. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. Looks like there was a mix, but it was a bit of a trick question, I will admit. So a lot of you, about 40%, said a multiple award IDIQ. Some of you said GWACs. Like I said, it's a bit of a trick question because you could make the argument that it fits into a lot of those different categories, right? It's an IDIQ-like contract that's held by one agency for use by other agencies with multiple vendors holding contracts. So it's kind of like a MAC, kind of like a multiple award IDIQ. In reality, though, it's really an entirely separate beast of its own. It's that last one, none of the above, because it has its own rules and regulations that differ from a lot of what we just discussed for IDIQs, how GSA administers the program, enters into those contracts. They're all just very different. So, for example, IDIQ, you have that kind of contractually obligated minimal order amount. In the GSA schedules world, once you're on schedule, there's really no guarantee that a government agency will ever actually purchase anything from you. So that's kind of the key difference is IDIQ does create a contractual obligation between you and the government based on that de minimis minimal order amount that's incorporated. But GSA schedule, it's kind of a different beast that the contract, really you're not making any money until you're actually on schedule selling products to the government. But it was a bit of a trick question, I know. So wrapping up the IDIQ discussion with some restrictions, IDIQs are awarded, again, using those FAR Part 15 negotiated contract procedures. So we're talking full and open competition. You cannot establish an IDIQ if what the agency needs is available, again, from those other required sources in FAR Part 8, including the GSA schedules, existing IDIQs, or other agency contracts the government has available. Has to use what's already available. Awards must be above the certain thresholds. Certain thresholds must be multiple award. And remember, there's always preference for multiple award to increase competition at both IDIQ and task order levels. Government has to be able to clearly lay out the scope before entering into an IDIQ. And on the multiple award side, again, fair opportunity has to be given to all IDIQ holders before issuing an order. Pros and cons on the pros side, once you have an IDIQ, the process for actually issuing a task order is much more streamlined, right? Even when you have to give all holders the opportunity to respond to an order, the government doesn't have to go through the full FAR Part 15 process each time it wants to actually issue an order. Similar to the GSA schedules, once you have those pre-negotiated rates, the government benefit is they can sometimes negotiate further discounts, which of course goes to one of the cons on the contractor side, that you tend to be selling things at less than open market, and that there's always risk that you would have to do further negotiations when working with your government customers. If you're lucky enough to win a task order, whether multiple award or single award, there are strict thresholds where neither the GAO nor the Court of Federal Claims has authority to entertain protests of those awards, which can be both a pro and a con if you're trying to protest the award. But if you win an award, it can be a pro that you are kind of protest proof in a lot of cases. There's some minimum guaranteed amount for the IDIQ, so you know you'll be receiving some money under the award. As we've mentioned for most of the other contract types, agencies have to consider whether their products can be ordered through an existing contract or IDIQ before a new competition. So where you have an established IDIQ, you may be at an advantage over companies still trying to break into the market. On the con side, though, you have, again, pre-negotiated terms and conditions, which make it difficult to negotiate more flexible terms in your orders without modifying the IDIQ. If you're not an IDIQ holder, you have to wait until the agency is ready to compete new ones, which can oftentimes take a long time because they have long periods of performance. If you're in a multi-award situation, there's no guarantee you'll actually earn the value of the IDIQ. The guaranteed minimum is often de minimis, maybe a couple $100s. And if you're a multi-award situation, right, you're competing each time for an award. It's not a guarantee that the agency is going to give it to you. And while the process for placing orders may be streamlined, the process for actually establishing an IDIQ can take a long time. Again, dealing with primarily FAR Part 15 contracting procedures, requiring full and open competition, it can be a lengthy process. Shifting now to some of the lesser known FAR-based contract types. First, I want to talk about letter contracts and FAR Subpart 16.603. Also known as undefinitized contract actions, or UCAs. These are mechanisms to authorize a contractor to immediately begin delivering supplies or performing services before the terms and conditions of the contract can actually be agreed upon when there's some urgent need to begin production. Elements the parties may not be able to timely agree upon include terms and conditions, even pricing. The letter contract does have to include a schedule setting forth a time in which all the terms are to be definitized. The hope is that parties will agree upon these terms within the set schedule, but be aware that if the parties fail to do so, the regulations give the government the right to unilaterally definitize the contractor's terms, even if you don't necessarily agree. Letter contracts are meant to be used sparingly, really when, again, there's some urgency and the government needs the contractor to start right away, so there's no time to really fully negotiate the terms of the contract. We actually saw a rise in the use of letter contracts during the early COVID days, particularly among DoD agencies, where agencies needed contractors to start performing immediately before they could do full negotiations. Some limitations, right? Letter contracts can only be used if the head of the agency makes a written determination that no other contract or option is suitable for the government's needs. The contract must be definitized within 180 days after the contractor submits a proposal or by the date the amount of funds obligated under the contract exceeds 50% of the do not exceed price. So there's a timeline on getting things negotiated and a contract entered into. If competition is required under FAR Part 6, there must be some competition in the selection of contractors. You can't just award one without any competition. And if the government typically can't amend the definitized contract to cover and do work not originally contemplated under the letter contract itself. So the negotiated contract has to remain within the scope of your letter contract that you've been working off of. Pros on this one are pretty straightforward, right? Letter contracts give contractors the right to immediately start working on a project, reducing the time it takes to actually negotiate the contract, or at least giving you a little bit more time to negotiate while you start working. On the con side, though, there typically are increased reporting requirements, including throughout the letter contract phase, to ensure that you're not exceeding those 50% of the costs. If proposals received do not align with the government's needs, it may take even more time for the parties to negotiate the definitized contract. And you're also working on a project without knowing 100% what your compliance obligations are going to be and whether your company is prepared to comply with those obligations as well. There usually are additional approvals necessary from the government. It's not something the government can do on a whim. And of course, again, the government has that right to unilaterally definitize the contract if the parties fail to do so within the specified time frame. So you can get started working on a project early, which is great. But just be aware that there's some risk that you're performing on a contract you don't know the terms to yet, that you're still negotiating, that could change, and that you need to get it done sooner rather than later, or risk the government kind of imposing their own requirements on you. FAR subpart 16.7, we have two additional kind of contract types called basic agreements and basic ordering agreements. These two are quite similar, but there's some distinctions worth mentioning. First, it's important to know these basic and basic ordering agreements, they're not actually contracts. They're what you might call an agreement to agree in the future. Little different than a letter contract, which even though contains terms that are not actually definitized, is still treated by the law as a contract and subject to contract law and enforcement regulations. So these are a little bit different than those. Starting with basic agreement, it's a written instrument of understanding executed between an agency and a contractor, setting forth the negotiated contract clauses, which will be applicable to future contracts entered into between the parties and during the term of the basic agreement. Basic agreements contemplate that the execution of a formal contract will provide for certain key elements, including the scope of work, price, delivery, and will incorporate by reference or append the contract clauses agreed upon in the basic agreement. Basic agreements may be used with both fixed price and cost type contracts and should include a term allowing either party to terminate the basic agreement with sufficient notice, but this termination will not impact any contracts already executed. It's just the basic agreement that would be executed. When exactly do we use basic agreements? Regulations say they're to be used where past experience and future plans indicate that a substantial number of separate contracts may be entered into with a contractor during the term of the basic agreement, and the government has substantial recurring negotiating problems with the particular contractor in question. So you need both of those elements for the government to use these. Basic agreements are not a way to circumvent competition. They have to be used only in connection with negotiated contracts. They also do not state or imply any obligation for the government to actually place future orders or contracts, nor do they obligate any funds. Additionally, in order to modify a basic agreement, the parties have to execute a modification to the basic agreement itself. They can't just make changes to the executed contract or order, and basic agreements should be reviewed and modified annually as needed as well. Pros and cons. Biggest pro is that basic agreements significantly streamline the process for negotiating contracts because you already have a set group of contract terms that are applicable to the contract being executed. Cons are that in order to change the basic agreement, for example, if you now find the terms unfavorable, you have to modify the actual basic agreement. You can't just negotiate in the execution of the contract. There's also no guarantee you'll actually receive a contract if you negotiate one of these basic agreements. It does nothing to actually help you in competitions. It just kind of limits your negotiating power after you win the award because those terms are automatically going to apply to your contract once you receive a contract award. Okay, so as mentioned, FAR subpart 16.7 also covers basic ordering agreements, which as mentioned, like BAs, are not contracts, but more like an agreement to agree on future contracts. Here the parties have a negotiated written instrument of understanding containing the terms and clauses that apply to the future orders during the term of the basic ordering agreement, a description of the services and supplies to be provided, and the methods for pricing, issuing, and delivering future orders under the basic ordering agreement. Basic ordering agreements are used to expedite contracting for uncertain requirements for supplies or services when specific items, quantities, and prices are not known at the time that the agreement is executed, but a substantial number of requirements for the type of supplies or services are anticipated to be purchased from the contractor in the future. This is different from a BA in a number of respects, but note Primarily that there's no requirement for there to be a history of negotiation problems with the contractor in question in order for the government to issue these basic ordering agreements. Like a BA, there's no implication or promise that the government will place a future order. Basic ordering agreements are required to be reviewed annually and can only be amended by modifying the basic ordering agreement, not the order or contract itself. Similarly, again, because BOAs are not necessarily priced and are not contracts entered into under the competition requirements in FAR Part 6, the government cannot actually issue an order against a basic ordering agreement without first getting prices in competition under FAR Part 6. So again, you can't use it to circumvent competition. It still has to occur. Orders under BOAs are often issued using optional form 347 orders for supplies and services as well. If you're at all like me, you might be asking yourself that they sound a lot like IDIQs and BPAs, where the government has that pre-negotiated terms and they're receiving funding only when the order is placed. You are correct, they sound really similar in some respects, but for some, there's also a lot of differences. So for starters, IDIQ is an actually negotiated contract because there is that mandatory minimum guarantee. So there's that consideration when entering and executing the agreement. BPAs are interesting though because they are kind of a list of products and services the government can place an order against creating a contract. But I think the main difference is the definitization of the contract terms. Under a BPA, all the terms, particularly prices, are already laid out. The government just has to order against them. With a BOA, there's still certain terms and conditions that have to be negotiated, particularly pricing terms. So the BOA will explain how the parties will arrive at the pricing, but they don't actually list the pricing for the specific products and services in question. Pros and cons of the BOAs are very similar to BAs. They do help with negotiation lead time because a lot of the terms are already agreed upon. Primary con, again, is there's no guaranteed minimum, no guarantee you actually receive a contract, and to change those pre-negotiated terms, you actually have to modify the BOA, not just the negotiated modifications. A couple more FAR-based contract types, dealing first primarily with small businesses. Small business contracting is a complicated regulatory area with continually increasing government interest in ensuring companies, particularly large businesses, are not taking advantage of these opportunities, which can oftentimes be a bit more streamlined than FAR Part 15. So small business set-asides can be full or partial, either the government setting aside the entire opportunity only for small or disadvantaged businesses to participate, or the government setting aside some portion of the contract's performance only for small businesses. And that means if you're not small, veteran-owned, woman-owned, etc., you aren't able to compete for those awards. Remember, too, there's a strong preference in government contracting for small business participation. So opportunities below the simplified acquisition threshold have to be set aside for small businesses, and even ones above the simplified acquisition threshold have a preference for set aside unless the contracting officer can prove that there aren't enough small businesses to compete and they aren't awarding at fair market prices. Advantages of small business set-asides: if you're small, it's probably a smaller pool of companies you're competing against. Less likely that you're going to be outpriced by larger businesses. Small businesses oftentimes are exempt from some of the more stringent FAR and DFARS requirements like cost accounting standards. If you're a large business, there could be opportunities for you to get involved as a subcontractor with less competition requirements, but be careful of the restrictions on limitations on contracting and affiliation that can often get you in trouble. Cons: small businesses are often inexperienced, often don't have the proper infrastructure to comply with all the requirements in the FAR and DFARS. And of course, if you're a large business, you can't compete for these opportunities. 8A set-asides, very similar to small business set-asides, but really a method to use kind of sole source procurement procedures to award contracts to a single vendor under the SBA 8A program. Biggest difference here is that only a qualified 8A small business contractor who's responsible can participate in these programs. It requires SBA approval and often a justification and approval being published as well, especially if the award is over $100 million. Pros and cons here are going to look very similar as a small business set-aside, just targeted towards 8A vendors now, right? If you're an 8A vendor, less competition, less likelihood you're going to be outpriced by large businesses. If you're a large business, there are opportunities to get involved as a subcontractor, but be careful again of those limitations on subcontracting affiliation issues that can tie up a lot of companies. Last of the FAR-based procurement types we have are broad agency announcements under FAR subpart 35-106. These are solicitation methods primarily for research and development efforts, providing for full and open competition under FAR Part 6. They're authorized for the acquisition of basic and applied research, that part of development not related to development of a specific system or hardware. So the objective is to encourage participation by science, technology, research institutions, meeting government goals for innovative ideas and approaches for general research. They're typically open, meaning proposals can be submitted on a rolling basis, and most result in either a FAR or non-FAR based agreement at the end of the proposal period. They're generally used when the government's looking for new and creative solutions, but a standard conventional statement of work could be too narrow because they want different ways that a company could approach solving the problem. And they must typically be funded with research, development, test, and evaluation appropriation funding, which is a specific type of appropriations that comes out every year. Big pro for the BAAs is it's a streamlined competition evaluation process. Proposals need to be evaluated in accordance with the stated criteria, but they don't have to be actually evaluated against each other because they're not submitted in accordance with common statement of work. There are, of course, limitations on the use of BAs that can only be used for a specific purpose. As with many contract types that we're about to see, negotiation of IP and data rights in the R&D space is really important, and important for contractors to understand what IP and data rights they're agreeing to give the government as well. And BAs cannot be used really for the acquisition of products or for production. It's only focused on research and development. Speaking of research and development, taking a step now outside of the world of FAR-based contract types, talk for a second about DoD small business research and development programs, the SBIR and the STTR. So these programs include a competitive three-phased process to solicit proposals from small business concerns for research and development, production, services, any combination thereof to meet the government's needs. SBIR is a competitive process where small businesses are awarded R&D funding. STTR tries to facilitate cooperation between the small business concerns and nonprofits. Both are aimed at kind of commercializing technology. Both are a gated process contemplating three phases: concept development, prototype development, and ultimately commercialization. And the government can use BAs, grants, agreements, or even OTAs to enter into these various phases as well. These programs obviously give small businesses opportunities to grow research and development and funding to pursue commercialization of their research. The ability to sole source phase 3 work if you were a phase 1 or 2 vendor obviously helps streamline the procurement process as well, but note that that may not be allowable if there's multiple vendors in the open market. There's lots of flexibility to negotiate terms and conditions under these programs too, and there are and can be significant IP data rights protections for small business participants, ensuring the government doesn't get too many of those rights. Big con, of course, if you're not small business, you can't participate in these programs. They are limited to small businesses. They are limited to research and development as well. Okay, we only have a few more of these left, so I'm going to try and power through them to make sure we have time for questions at the end too. So mentioned a second ago, OTAs. OTAs are other transaction authority agreements or other transaction agreements. You might hear them called different things. If you're aware at all of the CHIPS Act and semiconductor funding, you might know the biggest sort of hot topic OTA authority right now is the DoD Microelectronic Commons Program, which is using OTA funding to fund semiconductor research and development, which is different than infrastructure manufacturing grant funding we'll discuss in a moment. So these again are non-FAR-based contract types. OTAs primarily are used for research and development to advance new technologies, prototypes, and models. They're flexible contract types in the sense that they're, again, not subject to the FAR, not subject to a lot of federal contracting laws like the Competition and Contracting Act. And while some agencies have sort of standard templates they use, there's a lot of wiggle room for you to negotiate more favorable terms with the government. Importantly, only certain agencies can use OTAs. It's something they have to be granted statutory authority to use. But OTAs fall into kind of two buckets, research and prototype. Some people talk about a third category of production OTAs, but it's a bit of a misnomer. You see at the end of prototype OTA, the government has a streamlined method for entering into a follow-on production contract. That follow-on contract can be issued without competition in certain circumstances, but only if the original OTA was awarded competitively. Some other restrictions, again, no production authority under a research OTA, and there's usually a 50-50 cost sharing requirement. For prototype OTAs, there could be a cost sharing element as well, but it's not required, and contracts typically cannot exceed $500 million without additional approvals. Pros and cons. Again, most standard government contract laws are not applicable, so there's greater flexibility for negotiating your contracts. You have that streamlined approach for entering into follow-on production contracts. Some of the cons, most of these agreements are one of a kind, meaning it's hard to know going into negotiations what terms you can expect. And while greater negotiation flexibility is a positive, it also means the government has more flexibility to push for terms that are more favorable to them and less favorable to you. There's also limited bid protest jurisdiction over OTAs, which can make it difficult to challenge awards to your competitors when they're competed, when they go through competition. All right, cooperative research and development agreements, or CRADAs, another type of agreement targeted, of course, at research and development, but this one's a little unique because there's no funding actually involved. CRADAs are designed for federal labs to enter into agreements with other agencies, governments, companies, nonprofits, etc., for essentially cooperative research. So there might be licensing agreements for lab developments. There might be the sharing of IP or equipment to help commercial production, but there's no exchange of actual funding, at least not from the government. Similar to OTAs, you have a streamlined process here because there really aren't any competition requirements. Again, greater flexibility in negotiating because most of your standard contract laws do not apply. And it gives you access to government R&D and labs to help you commercialize and develop your research. Cons, it's limited to federal labs, and while you might be receiving resources, you're not going to actually be receiving any funding. And not included here, but again, it's another IP risk. If you're sharing any research or IP with the government, be sure that you're carefully negotiating those data rights and IP protections to protect your IP and inventions and not give the government unlimited rights. All right, this is my last one, I promise. Talk really quickly about financial assistance programs under 2 CFR Part 200 or the Uniform Guidance. So when we're talking about financial assistance, we're talking about grants, cooperative agreements, funding you're receiving from the federal government or another pass-through entity to achieve some public purpose. You're not selling a stapler to the DoD for them to use internally. You're building a bus station or building out broadband infrastructure, developing a domestic semiconductor manufacturing facility is funding to pursue one of those public purposes. Grants and cooperative agreements are treated the same under the regulations. The only difference is the level of government involvement in the project. With a cooperative agreement, there's this agreement that the government's going to be a lot more hands-on and involved in the project. Some restrictions, they may not be subject to the FAR, but they're still subject to stringent government regulations under the Uniform Guidance and agency adoption. There's little to no exemptions in this world for commercial contracting. It's just generally not recognized. And there's still some competition and some cost sharing requirements as well. And if you're interested in more about grants as well, there's a QR code to a federal grant survival guide that we wrote specifically for for-profit companies that kind of walks through all these different requirements and make sure that you guys are all aware of all of the strings that attach to grant dollars. Advantages of grants. Again, they're not DFARS-based contracts, so many of those obligations don't apply. There's currently billions of dollars coming in from recent congressional appropriations targeting for-profit companies for these programs. There's a lot of money out there that you can take advantage of. And by taking some of this money, you can pursue programs and improvements without having to bear the full cost of those projects. However, again, don't be fooled. Just because they're not DFARS based does not mean that they're just free money. Uniform Guidance contains a lot of strict requirements, including cost accounting principles, written procurement policies, detailed inventory and property controls There's also limitations on your ability to maintain program income. Your ownership is conditional and subject to a federal interest. There's a lot of things, and you can follow that QR code and learn more about them if you're interested. All right, last polling question of the day. If we could get our third polling question up. Last polling question of the day. True or false? OTAs, CRADAs, and grants are similar because they can only be used for research and development. (61, 62% voted. I'll give you guys a few more seconds. So I see we do have some questions to get through too. All right, I'll go ahead and end the poll. It looks like the majority of you, about 63%, said false, and that is correct. That is the correct answer is false. Again, grants can be used and historically have been used for research and development purposes, but they can also be used for a lot more things like infrastructure and public works projects as well. So while they can be research and development, that's not the only reason that they're similar. And that's all I have for today. This is just a quick breakdown again of all the different topics we've talked about. We reviewed most of the contract types that were on the DAU kind of cone of contracting types, but there were a few that I left out just because I knew we would kind of run out of time. But they're there listed on the screen, and you're welcome to kind of poke around the internet or email me afterwards if you have more questions about those. I know we have about 8 minutes left, and we have some questions in the chat function. So let me go ahead and start walking through those. Let's see, one question from Angela. Will you explain a bit more about GSA from the polling question 2? So polling question 2 was the question of what type of contract is the GSA schedules, and it listed all the different kind of IDIQs that we had listed. The primary distinction is that the GSA schedules program is just kind of governed for an entirely different way than the IDIQ programs. So like they're not covered by those FAR Part 16 requirements. They're covered by this separate FAR requirements for federal supply schedules, as well as the General Services Administration's own kind of contracting manual and regulations. So there's just an entirely different process you have to go through to apply, the information you have to submit when you apply, how you go about getting on schedule, how orders come about. But a big one, again, is IDIQs are technically contracts in and of themselves because they have that mandatory minimum that you are guaranteed by entering into that IDIQ, even if it's only $100. GSA schedules and some of the others like BPAs are technically not kind of contracts in that same sense because you don't have that exchange of funding just by entering into the schedules program. You have to wait until the government actually starts ordering things from you. But those are some of the kind of key differences for those ones. We have another question from Jason. Can you have a separate firm fixed price CLIN and time and materials CLIN or labor hour under the same contract? Yes, and it happens a lot. In particular, when you have things like enterprise solutions, government might be buying network services, but then you might also be offering professional services like IT support or installation and maintenance. So you'll have those fixed price CLINs or a fixed price contract for those products. But when you're dealing with the services themselves, you probably have a negotiated hourly rate for that CLIN for those professional services being provided. So we often kind of see those mixed together rather than time and materials being its own thing. Let's see. Stephanie asked, do basic ordering agreements for 1099s fall under basic agreement, FAR subpart 16.7? So yes, basic ordering agreements and basic agreements both fall under FAR subpart 16.7. I think basic agreements are 702 and basic ordering agreements are 703. So they do fall under that same FAR part. But again, they are treated a little bit differently. Basic agreements needed when you have that history of contract negotiation problems. Basic ordering agreements provide a little bit more detail on kind of some of the things like the statement of work, delivery schedule, things like that. But a big one being the description of price, how you do basic order agreements, basically tells you how to issue an order. Where a basic agreement, think of it kind of like an attachment of your mandatory contract terms that will eventually attach to the contract. So some differences there, but both covered under the same FAR provision. We have another question from Linda. How long is a basic agreement? They don't have a statutory mandated length. As I mentioned, they have to be reviewed annually to kind of make sure that they still align with the party's interests. And there's that right for either party to terminate at any time. You can probably negotiate into the contract that the term is 5 years, 1 year, whatever it might be. But really, there's no kind of limitation on how long they exist. That's up to the parties in the negotiations. Okay, question from Claire. If a GWAC like Alliant 2 or a MAC like Oasis is available, can individual agencies still choose to award their own multiple award contracts to satisfy the requirements that can be filled with an existing GWAC and MAC? So for the most part, the answer is no. As you've noted throughout there, most of these had that limitation on there that you can't use these contract types if you can get it basically through any other contracting vehicle. So unless there's some reason that makes it your agency needs unique, that you can't get exactly what you need from those GWACs, you will be required to go to those first and see if you can use those rather than kind of, again, reinventing the wheel and creating your own contract. Just, again, government's efforts to try and streamline these processes and make sure we're not having 20 different contracts out there that all include the same thing when you could order them from something that's already been competed. Scroll down here. See, yeah, Roya had a question about polling question 2. The answer was none of the above. Again, that was the one about GSA schedules compared to the IDIQs. And yes, the answer was none of the above for that one. And then Linda had a question, FAR Part 8 and FAR Part 12 all deal with commercial products and services. What determines preference for procurement under FAR Part 8 versus Part 12? It's an interesting one, and one that we end up coming across pretty much every time that we do a bid protest. But for the most part, when you're dealing with commercial products and services, the acquisition, the contract negotiation, all of that is going to be governed primarily by FAR Part 12. There are internal references between the two where in certain instances you should be going to FAR Part 8 and looking at the requirements and vice versa. But for the most part, all of the terms that you need for FAR for commercial acquisitions are going to be in Part 12. It gets more complicated because there are other sections of the FAR that also deal with commercial item contracting. But for the most part, start with FAR Part 12, and then it can supplement with the different areas as needed. See if there are any more. Joshua Lee, I'm not seeing any more questions. Do you see any that I missed?
Nope, I think you covered them all.
Awesome. And I see we have about a minute and a half left, so I will hang on if there are any other questions that come up. But if not, I just want to say again, thank you all for joining me today. I hope it wasn't super painful to walk through all of those and that I answered at least some questions about what the different contract types are. If you have any questions, please feel free to give me an email, send me an email after this. I'm happy to talk about anything that I confused or confused you about. But just thank you all for joining today.
Thank you so much, Ariel. As always, we'd love to know how we did today. All feedback is greatly appreciated. A reminder, we do not have passwords for GovCon 101, but make sure you guys did participate in the polls, and a survey will pop up at the conclusion. Make sure you guys fill that out. If you're seeking a certificate, you'll complete your survey on our website. The course should appear by the conclusion of today. So if you don't see it right away, just give it a little bit of time and you should see it by the end of today. And with that, I wish everyone a wonderful afternoon. Thank you guys so much.